Chapter 1, The Hate That Went Viral. Eddie McCoy learned which comments to read and which ones to scroll past without seeing. Praise blurred together after a while, iconic, king, marry me, a warm static that filled the space but never quite touched him. Criticism, on the other hand, cut sharper. It demanded attention, even when he pretended it didn't. The trailer was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant chaos of the set outside. Eddie sat hunched on the couch, script forgotten on his lap, phone glowing in his hand. He told himself he was checking schedules. He told himself a lot of things. The notification stared back at him. At Dalton Orico. Another Eddie McCoy interview where he answers questions without actually saying anything. Amazing how charisma can pass for substance if you smile long enough. Eddie exhaled slowly through his nose. There you are, he muttered. Dalton Orico wasn't just any anti-fan. He was the anti-fan. The one journalists quoted when they needed a balanced take. The one whose threads went viral because they were annoyingly articulate. No name-calling. No cheap insults. Just careful dissection, like Eddie was a performance under a microscope. Eddie scrolled. McCoy's strength has always been presence, not depth. When a role demands stillness instead of charm, he falters. See, last night's episode. Eddie's jaw tightened. He dropped the phone onto the cushion beside him and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the trailer. A makeup light buzzed faintly overhead. I didn't falter, he said aloud, to no one. But the words didn't sit right. Because the thing about Dalton Orico, worse than the hatred, worse than the audacity, was that sometimes, irritatingly, he wasn't wrong. A knock rattled the trailer door before Eddie could spiral further. His manager, Lila, poked her head in, already mid-sentence. We're 10 minutes from the next setup, and, she stopped, taking in Eddie's posture, the phone on the couch. Don't tell me you're reading comments again. I'm not, Eddie said automatically. She raised an eyebrow. Eddie. He sighed and sat up. Okay, I am. But this one's different. They're all different to you. No, he said, reaching for the phone again. This guy. Dalton Orico. Lila groaned. Oh, that one. Please don't tell me you're letting an internet critic ruin your mood. He's not ruining it, Eddie said, defensive. He's just, persistent. And unemployed, last I checked. Eddie's thumb hovered over the screen. An idea, reckless, impulsive, unmistakably his, sparked to life. What if, he said slowly, I hired him? Lila laughed. Actually laughed. You want to hire your biggest anti-fan. Most vocal, Eddie corrected. And articulate. You've officially lost it. Think about it, he pressed, sitting forward now. He already knows everything about me. He's organized, he's observant, and he clearly doesn't care about kissing my ass. That's not a qualification. It should be, Eddie said. His smile crept in, sharp with mischief. Besides, my last assistant quit this morning. Again. That is not a reason to invite chaos into your life. Eddie stood, pacing the narrow length of the trailer. I'm tired of people telling me what they think I want to hear. I want someone honest. Brutally honest. Lila crossed her arms. You're going to regret this. Maybe, Eddie said. But I'll be bored less. Dalton Orico reread the email 5 times. Then a 6th, just to make sure his brain wasn't betraying him. Subject, interview request, Eddie McCoy. From Lila Park Talent Management. His laptop sat open on the small desk in his apartment, surrounded by half-finished coffee and neatly stacked notebooks. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind that let thoughts echo. This has to be a joke, Dalton murmured. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He'd written the posts in moments of irritation, yes, but also conviction. Eddie McCoy represented everything Dalton distrusted about celebrity culture: polished narratives, carefully rationed vulnerability, applause without accountability. And now that same celebrity wanted to interview him. For a job. Dalton laughed, short and humorless. "They're going to rip me apart," he said to the empty room. "Or threaten me with an NDA the size of a phone book." Still, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. Curiosity, inconvenient and traitorous, 1. The lobby of the agency building smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. Dalton stood near the reception desk, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight despite the tightness in his chest. He wore his best button-up, sleeves rolled precisely twice, like armor. "Don't be impressed," he told himself as he was led down the hallway. "This is all just staging." Eddie McCoy was standing by the window when Dalton was shown into the office, sunlight catching in his hair, turning it almost unfairly golden. He turned at the sound of footsteps, smile already in place, then paused. Something flickered in his expression. Interest, sharp and unfiltered. "Dalton Orico," Eddie said, tasting the name. "You look exactly how I imagined." Dalton blinked. "That's not reassuring." Eddie laughed, the sound easy, disarming. "Fair. Sit." Dalton sat, folding his hands in his lap. He met Eddie's gaze head-on, refusing to look away first. "Don't let him charm you," he reminded himself. "That's the trick." "So," Eddie said, settling into the chair across from him. "You hate me." Dalton's mouth twitched. "I critique your work. With passion. With standards." Eddie's smile widened. "See, that's why I like you." Dalton frowned. "You don't even know me." "I know you're honest," Eddie said. "And that you pay attention. Most people don't." There it was again, that uncomfortable feeling, like being looked at too closely. Dalton cleared his throat. "Why am I here?" Eddie leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "I need a new personal assistant. Someone competent. Someone who won't lie to me. And someone who isn't afraid of me." Dalton laughed, a sharp sound. "You think I'm not afraid of you?" "I think," Eddie said quietly, "that you stopped being afraid a long time ago." The room went still. Dalton held his gaze, pulse loud in his ears. "If this is about silencing me." "It's not," Eddie said immediately. "I don't want you quiet. I want you close enough to say things to my face." "That's a terrible idea." "Probably." Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Dalton stood abruptly. "You know what? Fine. I'll do it." Eddie's eyebrows shot up. "Really?" "Yes," Dalton said, heart pounding. "Because I want to see if you're as shallow as I think you are." Eddie rose too, grin slow and dangerous. "And I want to see if you're as cruel as you pretend to be." They shook hands. The contact was brief. Electric. Both of them noticed, and neither commented. Outside, the internet was already preparing to explode. Inside, something far more complicated had just begun. Chapter 2, Professional Hostility. Dalton learned very quickly that working for Eddie McCoy was not the same as criticizing Eddie McCoy from behind a screen. At 7:30 on his first morning, Dalton stood outside Eddie's penthouse door with a tablet tucked under his arm, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. He had arrived 15 minutes early, partly professionalism, partly nerves he refused to acknowledge. The door swung open exactly on time. Eddie looked unfair. Not red carpet polished, not camera ready. Just bare-faced, hair still damp from a shower, black t-shirt clinging lazily to his shoulders. He held a mug in one hand and blinked like a man who had not slept nearly enough. "You're early," Eddie said. "You said 7:45, Dalton replied. "It's 7:30. Eddie smiled. "I like that already." Dalton stepped inside without responding. Don't, he told himself. Don't let him charm you. The penthouse was quiet, all glass and pale wood and expensive minimalism. It looked like a magazine spread no one actually lived in. Dalton catalogued everything automatically, open mail on the counter, a jacket slung over a chair, a faint scent of coffee and something sharper underneath. Stress, maybe. Eddie watched him the way people watched animals they weren't sure were friendly. So, Eddie said, leaning against the counter. What's first on the agenda, boss? Dalton glanced down at his tablet. You have a call with your publicist at 8. Makeup at 9. Table read at 11. Lunch is scheduled, not optional, even if you pretend not to be hungry. Eddie winced. Already bossy. Already honest, Dalton shot back, not looking up. You skipped lunch 3 times last week. Eddie straightened. You read my schedule history? I read everything, Dalton said. Then, after a beat, that's the job. Something unreadable crossed Eddie's face. Interest again. Annoyance, maybe. Or both. The call with the publicist was Dalton's first real test. Eddie slipped effortlessly into his public persona, warm, agreeable, non-committal. Dalton stood near the window, pretending not to listen while catching every word. When the call ended, Eddie exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. Thoughts? Eddie asked casually. Dalton hesitated. This is where I usually type it out and hit post, he thought. Not say it to his face. You deflected too much, Dalton said finally. You sounded safe. Eddie's smile thinned. Safe is good. Safe is forgettable, Dalton replied. They asked about your next role. You could have said something real. Eddie turned to face him fully now. And you think you know what real looks like? Dalton met his gaze. I think you're capable of more than what you give them. Silence fell, heavy and sharp. For a moment, Dalton wondered if he'd gone too far, if this was where Eddie would remind him who held the power. Instead, Eddie laughed softly. Not amused. Surprised. You don't pull punches, Eddie said. I told you I wouldn't. Eddie studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. Most people in this room are afraid of me. Dalton shrugged. I've already said the worst things I think about you. What's left to lose? Eddie's laugh this time was real. It startled both of them. The day unraveled in friction. Dalton corrected Eddie's schedule twice. Eddie ignored him once, then apologized when Dalton was right. Dalton refused to fetch coffee. Eddie stared at him like no one had ever said no before. I'm your assistant, Dalton said evenly. Not your servant. Eddie held up his hands. Noted. In the car between appointments, silence stretched tight and awkward. Eddie scrolled through his phone. Dalton stared out the window, city blurring past. You hate me less in person, Eddie said suddenly. Dalton turned. What makes you say that? You're quieter. That's because I'm working. Eddie hummed. You used to have a lot to say. I still do, Dalton replied. You just can't scroll past me now. That earned a grin. Later, in the dressing room, Eddie caught his reflection while a stylist fussed with his collar. He glanced at Dalton standing near the door, focused, composed, entirely unimpressed. Why does that bother me? Eddie wondered. He was used to being wanted. Admired. Even hated in loud, sloppy ways. Dalton's dislike had always been precise, scalpel sharp. Now that same precision was turned inward, toward Eddie's life, his habits, his flaws. It felt invasive. It felt grounding. That night, long after Dalton had left, Eddie lay in bed scrolling through old posts from at Dalton Orico. Words he'd read before, insults he'd bristled at. They read differently now. Not cruel. Not jealous. Disappointed. Eddie locked his phone and stared up at the ceiling, chest tight in a way he didn't have a name for. Meanwhile, in his small apartment, Dalton sat on his couch, jacket draped over the armrest, tablet abandoned on the table. He pressed his palms to his face and exhaled. "You're in trouble," he told himself. "You were supposed to confirm your worst assumptions." Instead, all he could think about was the moment Eddie had listened, really listened, without deflecting, without smiling it away. Dalton dropped his hands and stared at the wall. "This is just a job," he said aloud. But the words felt less solid than they had that morning. And somewhere between irritation and reluctant respect, something dangerous had begun to take shape, something neither of them was ready to name. Chapter 3, Cracks in the Persona. Dalton began to notice the cracks on the fourth day. Not the obvious ones, the missed meals, the late nights, the polite exhaustion Eddie wore like an accessory. Those were easy. Those fit the narrative Dalton already knew about celebrities who burned too brightly for too long. It was the quieter things that unsettled him. Like how Eddie's hands trembled just slightly before interviews, only enough that Dalton caught it because he was standing close. Or how Eddie's voice dropped half an octave when the cameras shut off, like he was physically setting something down. Or how, after a 12-hour day, Eddie lingered by the door of his own apartment as if stepping inside alone required more effort than facing a crowd of strangers. Dalton told himself not to care. He failed almost immediately. The panic attack hit 5 minutes before a live interview. They were in a narrow green room backstage, the air stale with hairspray and artificial citrus. Eddie sat on the edge of a chair, one foot bouncing. The host's laughter echoed faintly through the wall, too loud, too close. "You ready?" Dalton asked, checking the time. Eddie nodded too quickly. "Yeah. Fine." Dalton watched him inhale. Exhale. Inhale again, too shallow, too fast. "Eddie," Dalton said quietly. Eddie looked up, eyes bright and unfocused. Don't what? Don't analyze me like I'm one of your threads." Dalton swallowed. "I'm not. I'm concerned." That word hung between them. Eddie's jaw tightened. His hand curled into the fabric of his pants, knuckles whitening. "I can't breathe," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I know I can. I just..." Dalton moved without thinking. He crouched in front of Eddie, keeping his voice low, steady. "Okay. Look at me." Eddie hesitated. Then he did. "In for 4, Dalton said. "Out for 6. Don't rush it." Eddie followed him, clumsy at first, then steadier. The trembling eased. The color returned slowly to his face. After a minute, Eddie laughed weakly. "You're not in my job description." Dalton shrugged. "Neither is watching you pass out on live television." Eddie studied him, something vulnerable slipping through the cracks of his practiced composure. "You didn't have to do that." Dalton stood, offering a hand without comment. "Yes, I did." Later that night, Eddie sat alone on his couch, lights dim, phone balanced in his hand. His thumb hovered over an anonymous account he hadn't touched in years. He typed, erased, typed again. For what it's worth, panic attacks don't mean weakness. They mean you've been strong for too long. He stared at the words, heart thudding. Then he hit post. Dalton found the comment at 2 in the morning, curled up on his bed with his laptop open and his glasses sliding down his nose. He read it twice. Then a third time. It was buried deep in a thread defending Eddie from a particularly cruel rumor. The account name was unremarkable. The wording wasn't. Dalton sat up slowly. That sounds like him, he thought. The idea unsettled him more than any argument ever had. Work softened after that, not easier, but quieter. They shared coffee in the mornings without commentary. Dalton learned Eddie liked his too bitter. Eddie learned Dalton skipped sugar because it distracted him. Small facts, insignificant on their own, began to stack up. One afternoon, Eddie lingered in the doorway of the kitchen while Dalton organized files. "You ever think," Eddie said casually, "that people only love the idea of you?" Dalton didn't look up. "I think that's the price of being famous." "I didn't mean," Eddie stopped, sighed. "Never mind." Dalton glanced up then, really looking at him. The tired slouch of his shoulders. The way he rubbed at his wrist absent-mindedly. "You can finish the thought," Dalton said. Eddie hesitated. "I don't know who I am when no one's watching." The words landed heavier than Dalton expected. "You're allowed to figure that out," Dalton said quietly. Eddie's eyes flicked to him. "You don't think it's fake?" Dalton shook his head. "I think you've been performing for so long you forgot how to stop." Eddie swallowed hard. That evening, Dalton defended Eddie online for the first time. Not loudly. Not with fanfare. Just a few precise corrections under a false name. Context. Facts. Nuance. He told himself it was about truth, not loyalty. But when Eddie casually mentioned the thread the next day, how someone had said something smart, Dalton felt something warm and traitorous bloom in his chest. By the end of the week, Eddie realized something he wasn't ready to admit. Dalton didn't just see through him. Dalton stayed. And for the first time in years, Eddie wondered what might happen if he let himself be seen, completely, by the one person who had never wanted anything from him at all. Chapter 4, Lines begin to blur. By the second week, their days developed a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Dalton arrived early. Eddie pretended not to notice, even though he timed his mornings around it now, shower running a little longer, coffee brewed twice as strong. They rarely greeted each other with more than a nod, but the quiet between them felt less sharp, less guarded. Familiar. That familiarity was what made it dangerous. The car rides changed first. Before, the back seat had been filled with silence thick enough to choke on. Now, it held fragments of conversation, half-finished thoughts, dry observations about traffic, commentary on scripts Eddie pretended he hadn't memorized already. "This line doesn't work," Dalton said one morning, eyes on the tablet balanced against his knee. Eddie glanced up from his phone. "It's a fan favorite." "It's empty," Dalton replied. "You can do better." Eddie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Mark it." The ease of it startled them both. It was raining when the hotel mix-up happened. They were overseas for a press tour, jet-lagged and irritable, the city outside the hotel windows blurred by sheets of rain and neon light. Dalton stood at the reception desk, listening as the clerk apologized profusely. "We're very sorry," she said. "Due to a system error, we only have one suite available." Dalton's shoulders tightened. He turned slowly to look at Eddie. "No," he said flatly. Eddie raised an eyebrow. "We can survive one night." "I'll sleep on the couch," Dalton added quickly, as if that settled it. Eddie's mouth twitched. "You don't trust me?" Dalton met his gaze. "I don't trust proximity." Eddie laughed under his breath. "Fair." The suite was too big. Too quiet. The rain against the windows sounded like static, relentless and intimate. Dalton dropped his bag by the door, immediately scanning the space. One bedroom. One bed. A couch that looked decorative at best. "I'll take the couch," Dalton said again. Eddie watched him, arms folded. "You know, it's just furniture." "It's not about the bed," Dalton replied, too quickly. "It's about boundaries." Eddie nodded slowly. "Okay. That should have been the end of it." It wasn't. Later, Dalton emerged from the bathroom in borrowed sweatpants and a t-shirt Eddie had tossed at him without thinking. It smelled faintly like Eddie, soap, something warm underneath. Dalton froze in the doorway. Eddie was sitting on the edge of the bed, hair loose, glasses perched low on his nose as he scrolled through a script. He looked up. Too big? Eddie asked. Dalton swallowed. It's fine. It's not fine, his brain screamed. It's everything but. Sleep refused to come. Dalton lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, rainlight flickering across the room. He could hear Eddie moving occasionally, the rustle of sheets, a quiet sigh. You awake? Eddie's voice drifted across the darkness. Dalton hesitated. Yes. A pause. Then, softer, do you ever miss hating me? The question hit harder than Dalton expected. No, Dalton said truthfully. I miss being certain. Eddie let out a breath. Me too. Silence settled again, heavier now, weighted with things unsaid. Dalton rolled onto his side, eyes burning. This is a mistake, he thought. This closeness. And yet, when Eddie's breathing evened out, Dalton found himself listening for it, proof that he wasn't alone in the dark. The next morning was worse. They stood too close in the bathroom, brushing their teeth in awkward silence. Eddie handed Dalton a towel without thinking. Dalton took it without comment. Their fingers brushed. Electric. Both of them froze. Sorry, Eddie said at the same time Dalton did. They laughed, brittle and nervous, then stopped too abruptly. Eddie cleared his throat. Coffee? Please, Dalton said, grateful for the escape. Back home, the world resumed its noise. Interviews. Meetings. Fans pressing against barricades, shouting Eddie's name like a promise. Dalton watched Eddie slip back into the role seamlessly, smile polished, posture perfect. But now Dalton could see the effort beneath it. After one particularly grueling day, Eddie slumped into the back seat of the car, eyes closed. Tell me something real, Eddie said quietly. Dalton glanced at him. About what? About me, Eddie said. No filters. Dalton considered him, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand worried at his wrist. You're braver than you think, Dalton said finally. And lonelier than you let anyone see. Eddie opened his eyes. You don't have to say anything, Dalton added quickly. I just. Eddie reached out, stopping him with a light touch to the forearm. It was brief. Grounding. Thank you, Eddie said. Dalton's pulse spiked under his skin. They didn't speak the rest of the ride. That night, alone in their separate apartments, both of them lay awake, replaying the same moments, the brush of fingers, the quiet confessions, the space between them shrinking without permission. Whatever line had existed between professional and personal was no longer clear. And neither of them knew whether they wanted to redraw it, or step fully across. Chapter 5, The Scandal. The first headline hit at 6:12 a.m. Dalton saw it because he was awake, had been awake for hours, the uneasy feeling in his chest refusing to settle. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, once, then again, vibrating like a warning he couldn't ignore. He squinted at the screen. Eddie McCoy's anti-fan infiltrates inner circle. Was the hiring a publicity stunt, or a calculated betrayal? Dalton sat up slowly. No, he whispered. By the time he opened the article, his name was already everywhere. Screenshots of his old posts, cropped, highlighted, stripped of context, lined the page like evidence in a trial. Words he'd written late at night, sharp but thoughtful, now framed as obsessive, malicious. His stomach twisted. They make it look like I planned this. Another notification appeared. Who is Dalton Orico, and why does he hate Eddie McCoy? Dalton dropped the phone onto the bed and pressed his palms to his eyes. His heart pounded, each beat loud and humiliating. This was exactly what he'd feared. Eddie woke to shouting. Not in the room, but on his phone, messages piling up, Lila's name flashing insistently across the screen. He answered before he was fully conscious. "Eddie," Lila said, breathless. "We have a problem. I'm guessing it's not small." She didn't laugh. "It's bad. Dalton's old posts are everywhere. The narrative is that he manipulated his way into your life." Eddie sat up, dread pooling low in his stomach. "That's bullshit. I know. But the internet doesn't care about nuance." Papers rustled on the other end. "The board is asking questions. Sponsors are nervous." Eddie swung his legs off the bed. "What are you suggesting?" A pause. "Too long. Distance," Lila said carefully. "At least publicly. We need to show you weren't complicit." Eddie's jaw clenched. "You want me to fire him?" "I want you to protect yourself." Eddie stared at the wall, mind racing. Dalton's voice echoed in his head, "I don't trust proximity." The quiet way he'd stood his ground. The way he'd stayed. "I need to talk to him," Eddie said. "Eddie. I said I need to talk to him." Dalton arrived at Eddie's apartment early, like always. He was halfway through organizing emails when the door opened. Eddie stepped inside, hair messy, eyes dark with something Dalton had learned to recognize as strain. "You've seen it," Eddie said. Dalton nodded. "Every version." Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. "They're asking me to step away," Dalton said quietly. "Before it gets worse." Eddie's head snapped up. "Who asked you to do that?" "No one," Dalton said. "I did." Eddie took a step closer. "Dalton. I knew this would happen eventually," Dalton continued, voice steady but brittle. "You don't get to hire someone like me without consequences. And I won't be the reason you lose everything. This isn't your fault." Dalton let out a small, humorless laugh. "It's my words on those screenshots. They twisted them. They still came from me." Eddie reached out instinctively, then stopped himself, hand hovering uselessly in the space between them. "I can fix this," Eddie said. "I'll make a statement. I'll tell them." Dalton shook his head. "They won't believe you. And even if they did, you shouldn't have to defend me." "That's not how this works," Eddie said, frustration creeping into his voice. "You don't just disappear." "I do," Dalton replied softly. "That's what assistants do. We're invisible until we're inconvenient." The words hit Eddie harder than Dalton intended. Dalton pulled a folded envelope from his bag and set it on the counter. "My resignation." Eddie stared at it like it might explode. "No," he said. "I'm not accepting that." Dalton met his gaze, eyes dark but resolute. "You don't have a choice." They stood there, too close, not touching, both breathing too fast. "I didn't plan this," Dalton said, voice cracking just enough to betray him. "I didn't plan to care." Eddie swallowed. "Neither did I." For a moment, Eddie thought Dalton might stay, might say something reckless and brave. Instead, Dalton turned toward the door. "Take care of yourself," he said. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The apartment felt wrong without Dalton. Too quiet. Too empty. Eddie sank onto the couch, staring at the envelope until his vision blurred. His phone buzzed again, more messages, more demands, more noise. He didn't answer. Across the city, Dalton walked until his legs ached. He ignored the stares, the whispers, the way his phone kept lighting up with unknown numbers. By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion weighed him down like gravity. He leaned his forehead against the door and laughed weakly. "You did the right thing," he told himself. The words echoed back at him, hollow. That night, Eddie lay awake staring at the ceiling, the space beside him unbearably empty. Dalton lay awake too, phone face down on the table, fighting the urge to check if Eddie had posted anything, if Eddie had said his name. Neither of them slept. And in the silence they'd chosen, both wondered the same terrible thing. What if walking away hurt more than staying ever could? Chapter 6, Confessions Without an Audience. The theater smelled like dust and old velvet. Eddie noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the kind of place that had held 1,000 forgotten dreams and still remembered every one of them. The seats were worn, the stage lights dim and uneven, and the walls carried the soft echo of voices long gone. He shouldn't have been there. Lila had left 3 voicemails. The studio wanted a statement. The press wanted blood. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, relentless. Eddie silenced it. He stood in the back of the small community theater, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, heart thudding louder than the muffled voices drifting from the stage. Dalton's voice. Eddie closed his eyes for a second, grounding himself. Don't make this worse, he told himself. Don't ask for what you don't deserve. On stage, Dalton paced with a script in hand, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to a group of young actors clustered around him. No, don't rush the silence, Dalton said. Let it breathe. If you don't believe the moment, neither will the audience. Eddie felt something tighten in his chest. This is who he is, Eddie thought. Not an anti-fan. Not my assistant. This. Dalton turned, catching sight of Eddie at the back of the room. He froze. The room seemed to hold its breath. 5-minute break, Dalton said quickly. The actors scattered, murmuring. Dalton stepped off the stage and walked toward Eddie, stopping a careful distance away. You shouldn't be here, Dalton said. I know. Dalton crossed his arms, a familiar defensive posture. The press. I didn't bring them, Eddie said softly. I left my phone in the car. That earned him a flicker of surprise. What do you want? Dalton asked. Eddie glanced around the emptying theater. To talk. Somewhere that isn't watching. Dalton hesitated, then nodded toward the wings. 2 minutes. They stood in the narrow backstage corridor, brick walls cool and damp, the hum of old lights filling the silence. Eddie rubbed his palms together. I didn't accept your resignation. Dalton let out a short laugh. You didn't have to. I should have stopped you. Dalton looked away. You shouldn't have to save me from consequences. That's not what this is, Eddie said, voice tightening. I hired you because you scared me. Because you saw through me when everyone else bought the act. Dalton's throat worked. That doesn't make it fair. I know, Eddie said. But keeping you, that wasn't strategy. That was selfish. Dalton finally looked at him, eyes sharp and searching. Then say it. Eddie swallowed. His pulse roared in his ears. I kept you because I felt real with you. Because for the first time in years, someone wasn't impressed by me, and I didn't have to pretend. The words hung between them, naked and unguarded. Dalton exhaled slowly. You don't get to say that now. I know, Eddie said quickly. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Then why are you here? Dalton demanded. Eddie hesitated. Then, because you should hear this without cameras. Dalton's jaw tightened. My hatred wasn't about you, Dalton said quietly. Not really. It was about what you represented. Wasted potential. Stories told halfway. He laughed bitterly. You inspired me once. And when you stopped trying, it felt like a betrayal. Eddie's chest ached. I didn't know. I know, Dalton said. That's the problem. Silence settled again, heavy but different now, less hostile, more fragile. You didn't manipulate me, Eddie said firmly. You challenged me. You made me better. Dalton shook his head. And look where that got us. Eddie stepped closer, careful, giving Dalton space to pull away. I'm terrified, Eddie admitted. Of going back to being alone in a room full of people. Of losing the only person who ever told me the truth. Dalton's eyes flicked to Eddie's hand, hovering near his sleeve. You're asking for something you can't protect. I'm asking for honesty, Eddie said. Whatever that costs. Dalton closed his eyes. For a moment, Eddie thought he'd gone too far, that this would be the moment Dalton turned away for good. Instead, Dalton said softly, I cared about you. That's what scared me. Eddie's breath caught. I didn't want to, Dalton continued. I fought it. I told myself it was proximity, power imbalance, the thrill of being seen. He opened his eyes. But it was you. Eddie reached out, stopping just short of touching him. Then let me say this once, without an audience. Dalton nodded. I love you, Eddie said. The words felt terrifying and inevitable. Not the version of you that challenges me. The one that stays. Dalton's composure finally cracked. He turned away, pressing his palm to the brick wall, breathing hard. You don't get to love someone and not choose them, Dalton said hoarsely. I choose you, Eddie said immediately. Publicly. Privately. However you need. Dalton laughed softly, tears threatening. You don't even know what that would cost you. Eddie stepped closer, resting his forehead against Dalton's shoulder, not touching, not yet. I know exactly what it costs to walk away. Dalton let himself lean back, just a fraction. The sounds of the theater drifted back in, voices, laughter, life resuming. This doesn't fix everything, Dalton said. I know, Eddie replied. But it's a start. They didn't kiss. They didn't promise anything. But when Dalton turned back toward the stage, Eddie stayed, watching quietly from the shadows. And for the first time since the scandal broke, neither of them felt like they were running anymore. Chapter 7, Choosing Each Other. The press conference room was too bright. Eddie stood behind the podium, hands resting on either side like anchors, the glare of lights washing the color from the walls and turning every face in the audience into a blur of expectation. Cameras lined the back of the room, red lights blinking patiently, hungry. This was where narratives were decided. Lila stood off to the side, arms folded tight across her chest. She hadn't argued when Eddie told her what he planned to say, just closed her eyes and sighed, the way people did when they knew something couldn't be stopped. Eddie leaned toward the microphone. Thank you for being here, he began, voice steady despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. I want to talk about the last 2 weeks, and about Dalton Orico. A murmur rippled through the room. Eddie took a breath. No deflection. No charm. Just truth. I hired Dalton knowing his history of criticism, Eddie continued. Not as a stunt. Not as a trap. I hired him because he was honest when others weren't, and because I needed that honesty more than praise. A reporter raised her hand. Eddie nodded. Were you aware of his past posts when you hired him? She asked. Yes, Eddie said. I read them myself. The room buzzed louder. And you weren't concerned about sabotage? Eddie shook his head. No. Because criticism isn't sabotage. It's engagement. Dalton never tried to harm me. He challenged me. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. And he did his job with professionalism and integrity. Any suggestion otherwise is wrong. Lila exhaled slowly behind him. Eddie finished the statement without naming his feelings, but he didn't hide the truth either. He didn't apologize for choosing Dalton. He didn't soften it. When it was over, he stepped away from the podium knowing exactly what he'd done. He'd burned the bridge behind him. Dalton watched the press conference on a cracked laptop in the theater's office, the screen balanced precariously on a stack of scripts. He sat very still, hands folded in his lap, every muscle locked in place. When Eddie said his name, Dalton's chest tightened. When Eddie defended him, clearly, firmly, Dalton felt something in him give way. "Idiot," Dalton murmured, voice rough. "You didn't have to do that." But Eddie had. The phone rang moments later. Dalton stared at it for a long second before answering. "Yes. I meant every word," Eddie said on the other end. He sounded exhausted. Relieved. "I'm not asking you to come back." Dalton closed his eyes. "Good. I'm asking you to meet me," Eddie continued. "Somewhere quiet." They met at a small cafe tucked between two bookstores, the kind of place no one would think to look. Eddie wore a cap pulled low, sunglasses tucked into his jacket. Dalton arrived first, choosing a table by the window. When Eddie slid into the seat across from him, Dalton studied him, the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "You didn't have to burn your career down for me," Dalton said. Eddie smiled faintly. "I didn't. I rebuilt it." Dalton scoffed. "That's optimistic." Eddie leaned forward. "I meant what I said before. I choose you. But I won't trap you in my orbit again." Dalton's fingers curled around his coffee cup. "You're offering distance." "I'm offering choice," Eddie said. "No contracts. No obligations. If you stay, it's because you want to." Dalton searched his face for manipulation. Found none. "I can't be your assistant," Dalton said finally. Eddie nodded. "I wouldn't ask." "I won't hide," Dalton continued. "I won't pretend this doesn't affect me. I wouldn't want you to." Silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. Dalton took a breath. "Then I'll stay. Not for the job. For you." Eddie's smile broke, soft, disbelieving, real. "For me." "For us," Dalton corrected. They walked out together. No holding hands. No declarations. Just shoulder to shoulder, steps falling into sync as the city moved around them, indifferent and loud. Eddie felt lighter than he had in years. Dalton felt terrified, and certain. They didn't know what the future would demand of them. Only that they were done pretending the cost of honesty was too high. Choosing each other, they discovered, wasn't a grand gesture. It was a quiet decision made every day. And this time, neither of them planned to walk away. Chapter 8, From Critic to Home. The applause was softer now. Eddie noticed it the first time he stepped off stage after a small theater Q&A, the kind that didn't make headlines or trend online. It wasn't the thunderous roar he'd once chased, but it was steady, earned. It followed him like a warm echo rather than a demand. He liked it better this way. Backstage, he loosened his tie and reached for his phone out of habit. There was one message waiting. "Dalton, how'd it go?" Eddie smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Eddie, they asked real questions. I gave real answers. A beat. Dalton, proud of you." The word settled into Eddie's chest, solid and grounding. Dalton wrote in the mornings now. Not in anger. Not to dismantle someone from a distance. He sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the page, coffee cooling beside him as he typed. His name sat at the top of his articles, no pseudonym, no shield. His criticism was still sharp, but it was fair. Thoughtful. When he praised Eddie's new performance, he did it plainly, without qualifiers or defensiveness. He hesitated before hitting publish. This isn't favoritism, he reminded himself. It's honesty. He clicked the button. They didn't move in together right away. Instead, they built something slower, quieter. Eddie spent nights at Dalton's place, curled on the couch with scripts while Dalton read beside him, their legs touching, comfortingly mundane. "You're frowning," Dalton said one evening, glancing over his book. "This scene," Eddie replied. "It feels dishonest." Dalton set the book down. Then change it. Eddie looked at him. You tell me if it was bad. Dalton smiled, small and fond. You know I would. That certainly mattered more than any applause. The first time Eddie cooked for Dalton, he burned the pasta. Dalton laughed until his sides hurt, leaning against the counter as Eddie stared at the smoking pot in horror. I have been lied to, Dalton said. You've played chefs. You have not learned. Eddie groaned. I can cry on cue and memorize 40 pages of dialogue, but boiling water is where I fail. Dalton stepped in, nudging Eddie aside. Sit. I'll save us. Eddie watched him move around the kitchen, familiar and sure, and felt something deep in his chest settle into place. This, he thought. This is home. The internet never stopped talking. There were still comments. Speculation. People who wanted to define them before they could define themselves. Eddie read fewer of them now. Dalton read almost none. Do you miss it? Eddie asked one night, lying beside Dalton in the dark, the city humming outside the window. The anonymity? Dalton asked. Yes. Dalton considered it. Sometimes. But I like being accountable. I like standing by my words. Eddie turned toward him. Even when it's about me? Dalton met his gaze. Especially then. Eddie laughed softly and pressed a kiss to Dalton's temple, simple, unhidden, real. Months later, Eddie stood in the doorway of Dalton's apartment, keys in hand. Are you sure? Dalton asked, trying, and failing, to sound casual. Eddie smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. They stepped inside together. No cameras. No statements. Just the quiet knowledge that they'd chosen each other not once, but over and over again. Dalton, once the sharpest critic in Eddie's life, became the place Eddie rested when the world grew loud. Eddie, once the distant figure on a screen, became the man who made Dalton coffee in the morning and listened when he spoke. Love didn't arrive as a grand gesture. It arrived as honesty. As trust. As the freedom to be fully seen. And in that shared, unremarkable quiet, they found something extraordinary. Not fame, not victory, but home.